Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with season one coming to an end, I wanted to take some time here and just talk about how the season actually went from my perspective, discussing what worked and what didn't in terms of a lot of the major system changes that we saw added in the War Within, as well as just giving some suggestions on things I think would really improve season two, which will be coming to the PTR in early 2025. Of course, I'll be putting my standard content out for season two as well, including reviews of the tank specs, powerful trinkets you want to be getting in the season, as well as guide videos for both Mythic Plus and Raid. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel to be prepared for Undermined launch. Now, as I'm sure some of you are aware, there's actually been quite a few major changes posted by Blizzard over the past few weeks to live servers, as well as the patch notes for the initial PTR build for 11.1, which do address some of the concerns that I put into this video initially. So I've adjusted those, and we're going to talk about all those changes as well a bit here. And they do give me a lot more hope for the start of season two, as they seem to be addressing a lot of the problems that players have been pretty vocal about so far this expansion. I'm not going to go word for word through all of these announcements since they've been covered a lot in other videos. Instead, I do want to quickly just go over the exact issues they address and discuss some issues that still remain. And we're going to start here with Crests. Of course, there were very significant changes pushed to Crests to live servers in patch 11.07, with the biggest one being an increase to Crests gained, where it now scales with key level all the way up to plus 12. And if you're on something like an alt, you don't want to do the jump up that is plus 12s and you're just spamming something like plus 11s, you're gaining 50% more Crests is essentially what happens there, which is very, very significant, right? Previously you were earning 12. Now you're going to be earning 18 if you just do 11s, which is pretty feasible on alt characters. This is also paired with the reduction of Crest lost if you don't time a key, which is now just a flat 4 instead of a flat 7. And this is 4 off of the scaled up number as well. So hopefully this is going to help address a lot of the pug players kind of abandoning dungeons at the first sight of it maybe being a deplete, because the crest you're losing is just insanely not worth it. And you're just rewarded now for doing that higher content, even if you do deplete, right? An 11 depleted is still the same amount of crests as a 9 in time, right? So that allows you to do potentially more competitive content on your alts and not feel absolutely awful about your crest gains if you do deplete for any reason. In addition to the acquisition adjustments, there's also a couple of discounts that they adjusted as well. So the mythic eye level crafted gear now only requires 60 crests, down from 90, very significant. And the Harbinger achievement here is now down to 636, so that's max crafted eye level instead of 639, making it way more feasible to actually unlock for a larger portion of the player base. Speaking as someone who raids in a top 100 guild, even I didn't have the Harbinger achievement before the patch here that got implemented that added this change. So you can imagine that this goal was definitely just unreachable for a large portion of the player base. So this is definitely nice, especially because it was put in to help alts upgrade. So now it actually is achieving that. Again, very, very nice. All of this is on top of the change as well earlier in the patch they made that allowed gildeds to drop at a +8 instead of a +9. And I think combined with the crest system changes here, it's just in a much better spot for the start of season two. That being said, I think there's still a couple of things that could make this even better. Crest acquisition, I think, is still going to be a massive mountain blocking a lot of players from enjoying alts, or for new or returning players from catching up later on in the season. Recently on live servers, we saw the removal of the crest cap, which pretty much does absolutely nothing to assist with that problem at this point in the patch. And while the gains from the changes that we did just talk about are great, you're still faced with a pretty large wall in terms of gearing up. It's like 50 plus keys to actually get enough crests to gear a character, even with these changes. I think taking an idea out of PvP's book later on in a season would help a ton with player retention. And by that, I mean adding some sort of flat crest acquisition modifier to increase gains from all sources, similar to the conquest modifier that gets added in. And I think the perfect time to add that modifier in would be with the 0.7 patch. It's late in the season, players are starting to lose interest. Maybe they come back shortly before the next major patch to kind of get a character prepared and stuff like that. Having a flat crest acquisition buff that would also apply to raids, of course, as well, at That point of the patch, I think, is totally fair. And again, I don't think that needs to happen early. I think these crest changes alone help for the vast majority of the season. But once crests get effectively uncapped, I don't see a reason not to speed up the crest acquisition for any of the players that are still actually actively participating in a season. Outside of crest acquisition, I did have one thought about the upgrade system itself. And maybe this is like a high-end out of touch player thing, but I personally felt like hero track crests were outgrown very, very quickly within just a couple weeks at the start of the season. And from talking to other players kind of around the community, it seemed that it created almost this huge gearing wall at like 619 eye level, particularly for players who, unlike me, didn't have great access to myth track gear outside of maybe their Mythic Plus vault. As a potential solution, I think you could make hero crests work for one more upgrade than they currently do, so to 5 out of 6 hero track instead of just 4 out of 6, which would just put that wall at 623 instead of 619. But it also gives a bit more value to those crests themselves. It allows players who are gated at myth track gear or gated by getting myth track gear to go a little bit higher in their progression, which maybe helps them out a little bit to get more myth track gear initially. And I don't think this pulls out too much value from those myth crests, because if you consider with the expansion, the myth track was extended from 4 spots to 6. Taking one step away from that, it's still more total steps than existed in Dragonflight, and I think that is fine. But again, this is maybe more of a minor nitpick here. Then let's talk about Valor Stones, which is something a lot of other players have discussed, so I won't spend too much time on it. Like a lot of other players, I really don't understand why this currency exists as an arbitrary gate. You already have to go out and earn all the crests. Why do I also need to make sure I have enough of this currency, which has relatively low cap considering some of the cost requirements, especially on things like two-handed weapons? You get a lot of upgrades early on in the week. You can spend through your entire cap and still have a bunch more upgrades to go. And maybe you've been capped for a long time already at the end of the previous week, and it's just a bunch of wasted, essentially, currency that is now arbitrarily gating you. Personally, I don't see how this currency is anywhere other than neutral at best to the player, and in a lot of cases it is negative, and I'd like to see them gone, but I could see a compromise here with maybe increasing the cap to at least 3,000 from the current 2,000, and potentially even making them warband transferable so that my permacapped main can send some over to alts early on in the gearing process who are spending a lot of currency to upgrade, and they would be a little bit alleviated. I'm playing some character, at least doing some content somewhere else. I should be able to kind of ship that off maybe to my alt, and it's not quite the same again because that character still has to earn crests, right? So it's not like they're getting free upgrades. I'm not sending them crests. I'm just sending them this kind of throwaway currency, right? If you're going to keep them, I think that's kind of the best way to keep them. And I can't take credit for that idea on my own because it's actually something that Banchers wrote about in recently. He had a post on the competitive WoW forums. And for those who don't know, Banchers is a high-end hunter player. He's actually also my guildie, and he's put out this, I'm going to call it the Banchers Manifesto here, his Mythic Plus Manifesto, where he talks about a lot of things here. I'm going to be referring to this quite a bit over the course of this video because he put out a ton of ideas in this. So it's a 6-page document currently. Again, not going to go word for word through it, just will be referencing it a fair bit. Make sure you do go show him some love. He streams a lot over on Twitch, maybe on YouTube now as well, not sure. I'll link his channel down in the description below if you want that. But one of the things he actually mentions in this document isn't gameplay related at all, but it is related to crests here, and that is the actual crest naming conventions. And that's something I didn't really think about until he posted about it. It's a pretty minor thing, of course, but he does make a good point that it is very confusing. As someone who played in Dragonflight, I actually can't even really remember the crest names in the War Within a lot of the time because they just don't really make sense. Right? Maybe I'm the only one that feels that way, but I mean, at least in Dragonflight, you had that progression where you're going from Whelpling, you're growing to a Drake, to a Worm, and then finally to an Aspect, right? You're growing each time, but now it's what? There's like Gilded. I can't even remember what the heroic track one is still. Maybe, I don't know. It's something, right? But it doesn't make sense to me, at least. Maybe maybe I'm out of it, but I feel like you could just go with the boring names and call them the same name as the track, and it would be infinitely more new player friendly, right? Just, it would be very, very obvious. Hey, this is a hero crest. It's for the hero track. This is for the myth crest, for the myth track. And obviously, again, you have the overlaps where it's a little different, but, you know, some name that is much more obvious probably would help make the system a bit less confusing. But again, that's probably a pretty minor change. Now, we've talked about crests enough here. Let's move on, and we're going to talk about gearing and rewards from Mythic Plus. To start, I want to talk about the Great Vault because it saw a couple downgrades moving into the War Within, and I'd like to see it get improved to be a bit more rewarding going into Season 2, specifically when it comes to the Mythic Plus portion of the Vault, though some of these changes would help players regardless of the content they're completing. First, the actual eye level of the rewards I think could see just a little bit of a bump on the top end, kind of pairing with the statement they made in that big Crest post that we just covered, where they want to reward more difficult content. And I think it would be nice to maybe see the ability to get something like 2 out of 6 myth track gear from doing plus 12 keys and above, rewarding players who push that next level up of keystone difficulty with just a little bit of crest savings, as opposed to something on an entirely new track, just so that players don't feel forced to push past plus 10s, but there is a little bit of a benefit there. And the reason for that is there's just a very obvious crest discrepancy, particularly early on in a patch, between players that have raid vaults, mythic raid vaults particularly, and mythic plus vaults, because the raid gear just tends to be higher up on the track, so you just save a ton more crests. The other thing that I would like to see addressed is expanding on what you can actually get with your bad luck tokens from whiffing on a vault, especially because the value of those tokens are kind of at an all-time low this season, now that you can only get sockets on helmets, bracers, and belts, basically, because all your jewelry sockets are covered by the jewel crafting item. I actually have 3 different suggestions here with varying levels of cost as well as determinism, if that is a word. We're going to say it's a word. Determinism, but basically just different levels of RNG attached to them depending on the design goals Blizzard wants with the system. And with the return of dinars for raid in the new Renown track, it does seem that they are open to more deterministic forms of gearing, so we'll see. One thing I will not be including that I hear a lot about is an item that lets you put tertiaries on gear. Blizzard addressed this in an interview a while back, I believe, and they made some very valid points, I think, regarding how walking into a new tier with a full set of leech gear or a full set of avoidance gear just has a massive impact both on gearing, getting new items because they have less value because they don't have tertiaries, as well as the tuning of the encounters themselves. So we're going to avoid that specific request because I do actually agree with a lot of the points they made. So let's start with the most deterministic option, which is what I like to call we have dinars at home. Essentially, this would be some item that you could buy using somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks of those bad luck tokens, which you could apply to a 6 out of 6 hero track item in order to push it up to the myth track. Players would still need to both earn the item itself as well as invest crests to actually upgrade it, so there is still some effort on the player's part here as opposed to just buying a BIS item off of a vendor, which is something Blizzard has said they want to avoid. But at the same time, it helps players to actually target a specific, say, weapon or trinket that they otherwise may never see for the entire duration of a season on the highest track due to the RNG of the vault, even if they fill their vault the maximum amount every single week. And you will notice that the price tag on this is actually very high because of this solution being so deterministic. You don't want the best thing every week to be to just take tokens so that you can get this upgrade if it's like the cost of only like 1.5 weeks, for example, something like that. Maybe you just take tokens every week and you just upgrade a gear every week and a half, right? So that's something you want to avoid. So there has to be some real cost to this, so you will take an upgrade if it's in the vault, but just having something to protect people that continuously get bad vaults is definitely needed. Now, if that is too deterministic, let's move on to option 2, which basically ports the treasure map system from Delves to Mythic Plus. So you could buy a map, and this one would be cheaper here because it's less deterministic, so somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks worth of tokens, and this would give you a single use item that causes your next completed dungeon to drop an additional item for you specifically at a higher than normal item level. And you could set myth track drop here to be whatever you want it, like you could say it at plus 10. If you do a plus 10 key with a treasure map, it's going to be a myth track item. If you do a plus 12, maybe if you want to do it higher, whatever it is, you can set that difficulty. And it's not fully deterministic because, again, you're applying it to a specific dungeon. So it's going to be something from that dungeon loot table. But also, again, you can target it because it's from a dungeon loot table. So it's in the in-between here between full RNG and full determinism. Hence why it costs fewer tokens. Plus, it does require you to still complete a relatively equal difficulty of content to actually get the highest level of rewards. Final option here, the least deterministic option, we just have the ability to reroll vault slots. You could make this apply to a single slot, an entire row, maybe even just the whole vault gets re-rolled. Basically just gives you a redo on a missed vault, and this of course would be the cheapest of the three options, seeing as it has the most RNG involved. Now, moving away from the vault, I've also been pretty outspoken in wanting there to be more cosmetic rewards from Mythic Plus, specifically somewhere between portals and the 0.1% title, as it's just a massive chasm of kind of nothing there right now. So it'd be nice to have something for players who don't really want to push for title to work towards, instead of just kind of pushing for the passion, right? It also is a side effect of just generally encouraging more participation in those key levels, which is only a positive thing. This could be a variety of different rewards, but the easiest one in my opinion is a Mythic Raid Transmog recolor for the tier, right? Just take whatever the Undermined tier, take that, make another recolor for Mythic Plus, put that in at some rating value. Could be something like Keystone Heroes 2500, so you could do the Mythic set recolor at like 2750. You could do some weapon transmog like 3K, maybe a new mount at 3250, something like that. That one is getting pretty close to the 0.1% title, though. I think it's going to be around 3400 this tier, most likely. So, again, you have a lot of different things you could add. Some are easier than others, but overall, just having more rewards in that gap, I think would do a lot to help increase participation and give players incremental, reachable goals instead of the only giant stretch goal being the 0.1% title above that point. From there, I'd like to shift gears and talk about the affix and general design philosophy changes for Mythic Plus going into the expansion. First, Fort and Tyran always being active has essentially just given us universal scaling, where players are instead eased into it with one activating at a time, and at the high end, they're just both always active. And I think it's been successful at making bosses tuned a bit better, at least in terms of duration, as they can now just always assume Tyrannical is active instead of trying to balance high keys or even mid-level keys around. Some weeks there's Tyrannical and some weeks there isn't. I also think there were a lot of wins with the new Xal'atath Affixes. Yes, they had to be reined in and nerfed a bit earlier on in the season, but I did personally enjoy a lot of the Kiss Curse weekly affixes, and definitely if I had to choose between those and things like Sanguine, things like Bolstering, I'm taking the Kiss Curse affixes every single time. These are also seeing some quality of life adjustments in Season 2 with more consistent curse effects, making them easier to actually understand, plus the removal of the Soak affix, which seem to have the most bad overlaps out of all of these new affixes, so hopefully the replacement has less issues. Now, despite these affixes having some of those annoying overlaps we just mentioned, I actually didn't mind it most of the time because you could usually play through that curse effect since they only appeared on keys below 12, which brings us to the Guile affix, which had some pros and cons. The pro, of course, being what I just mentioned. You don't need to worry about only playing big keys on push weeks. You don't need to worry about affixes interacting poorly with certain trash pulls or bosses. They no longer exist. In terms of negatives, the flat scaling modifier on it kind of created this massive wall at plus 12, which really hurt the pug community, particularly before they nerfed it from 20% to 10%. But even after it was reduced, it still just disrupted that steady difficulty curve, slowly increasing that currently exists in Mythic Plus. Luckily, this is actually being addressed in Season 2 with a change that did confuse a lot of people, so let me break it down real quick here. As of 11.1, Guile is being changed to a scaling modifier adjustment instead of a flat additional increase, so it now reads that keystones above level 12 increase health and damage by 12% per level instead of 10% per level. Not 100% sure if this would then kick in at a plus 13, as the wording alludes to, or if this is just kind of miswording and it's going to continue kicking in at a plus 12, which is what I personally would expect. But either way, what this does is remove that big initial jump when Guile activates, and it just slowly eases you into it. Noggy has been kind enough to do the math over on Twitter, which I will put on screen now. His does assume that it kicks in at plus 13 according to the current wording, so keep that in mind. But essentially what this equates to is that keys plus 12 through plus 17 are going to be slightly easier in Season 2 relative to Season 1, and then keys plus 18 and above are going to be slightly harder. Personally, I think removing that wall at plus 12s, especially with the addition of the Legend achievement at 2850, is just better for the health of the game, so I'm happy to see it introduced. That brings us to some of the things I think it didn't work great, where I think at the top of my list, which has yet to be addressed, is the Challenger's Peril Affix. Personally, I think even with the recent nerf it got, causing it to add 1.5 minutes to the key timer, it just has too many negatives. For example, it drastically increases the punishment for not only individual deaths, but also tank deaths, because then, it's a role where, if you die, likely many other people, if not your entire group, are also dying, and there's already a lot of responsibility on that role. It also has a pretty negative impact on pug group mentalities, making people more averse to inviting non-meta specs. And finally, dying is already extremely punishing as is in a Mythic Plus environment. You either have to commit a battle res, which you have a limited number of, or you have to run back whatever distance the graveyard is, which is hit and miss depending on the dungeon and where you are. Plus, you lose any buffs like Spy Masters or damage cooldowns that were currently active at the time. Personally, I'd rather something that either removes or doesn't impact the death timer at all, and instead is a flat reduction on key duration. But honestly, I would also be very, very happy with them just rethinking here and putting something entirely new on the +7 affix slot. Next up, I wanted to talk about the philosophy change when it comes to interrupts and stops, as we saw some pretty drastic changes from the end of Dragonflight, where the majority of abilities would go on cooldown if a mob was CC'd during the cast, compared to now, where specifically only channeled spells are stopped when you use a CC on them. Everything else will just recast once that CC expires. Now, this new Mythic Plus world that we find ourselves in has definitely been a bit frustrating, I'd say, especially coming from a tank POV, where I'm sure I'm not the only one that has been killed in a dungeon like Grim Patrol, where you pop a defensive for one of those like nasty slash tank busters, and then the mob gets CC'd once or twice, not even on purpose, just by incidental micro CCs, and then the slash ends up recasting and hitting you, but your defensive has now expired. Personally, I think both the current and the Dragonflight situations are opposite extremes here, and I really do think there exists a happy medium somewhere in the middle where stops exist but aren't overwhelming. I know part of Blizzard's logic for this change was increased clarity and consistency in spell behavior, but I think there are ways you can still have that by adding something like a visual indicator on or around mobs when they're casting a spell that is stoppable with a CC. You could also pair this with a bit of a pruning when it comes to micro CC abilities that I was mentioning earlier, just to help avoid the situation of Season 3 or Season 4 of Dragonflight, where you could chain CC packs for multiple minutes straight. Definitely, that is too much, right? So maybe that could be peeled back a little bit if you're going to reintroduce stops. That being said, if reintroducing stops is just something that is completely off the table, I think they need to take a much harder look at spam casters and even just spellcasters in general in Mythic Plus, and either tone down cast frequency, increase cast time, or both, just across the board to make things a bit more forgiving and feel more fair. Also, just kind of as a small aside here, battle reses were made much easier to obtain, and now that they're no longer restricted to engineers and can be bought on the auction house, this was a great change that helps to alleviate that requirement in your group composition. Would really like to see a similar thing happen for drums, buffing it up a bit from where it is currently, just to make it a bit more competitive with Bloodlust. It doesn't have to be equal, right? It's still going to be that like 5% worse. So I think the gap right now is just a bit too big, and it feels very, very bad if you're forced to use drums, which means a lot of groups in the LFG just AFK, wait for a Bloodlust character to actually apply and take them. It's a bit more comp restrictive, right? So allowing drums to be stronger would open up the potential comps in LFG. Even if you don't need that Bloodlust, right, it just feels bad, and so pug groups are going to wait for it, right? Moving on, I wanted to talk about key depletion, which Blizzard is partially addressing in patch 11.1 with a new account-wide achievement that I mentioned earlier at 2850 rating that prevents your key from depleting below +12. And for those wondering what that means for keys completed to actually unlock it, it's roughly 4 +12s and 4 +11s in time. This is definitely a welcome change, as it helps make pugging your own key a bit less scary, especially on alt once you've actually gotten this achievement on your main. And at the same time, it also doesn't turn the highest level of keys into a tournament realm scenario where you're just constantly resetting the key because it doesn't deplete anymore. That being said, I think this idea could be improved slightly, and I actually had a great suggestion about this in the comments of my recent 11.1 news roundup video, where instead of this being an all or nothing thing that you get at +12s, what if you were able to gradually build up your depletion immunity? So at like 1500 rating, you now can't deplete below +4. At KSM, you can't deplete below +7s. At Keystone Hero, you can't deplete below +10s. And then finally at this new achievement, plus 12s. Again, the actual thresholds of when this depletion immunity kicks in could be adjusted here, but I think this gradual buildup of depletion immunity interacts with way more players doing keys than the current achievement due to its relatively high rating requirement, which, like some of my other suggestions, will only benefit the player base as a whole and encourage more participation across all key levels, especially with players who have some anxiety with posting their own key up in LFG. When it comes to encouraging more players to actually finish keys that they've started, of course, the Crest changes we talked about earlier is going to help with that, but Banchers also made a great suggestion in his document where Lindormi, who is the key reroller at the end of a dungeon, now always appears instead of only appearing on keys that you actually timed. Again, having more things that help alleviate levers is only a good thing in my eyes, and one of the best ways to do that is to give people more incentives to stay as opposed to just having flat punishments all the time. Plus, this also has the added benefit of helping players actually get keys that they want to do and re-roll things a bit easier, whether they've completed something in time or not. Now, I did also want to talk a bit about untimed content here, especially with the news that Blizzard has been sending out surveys on the topic of shifting Mythic Plus to a death system like Delves instead of the current timer system. Personally, I'm not a fan of that idea since I think that would really slow down the gameplay probably a bit too much, and at least for me, I'm not interested in doing things like CCing half a pack and then waiting for cooldowns, offensive or defensive, between pulls just to minimize all potential deaths. But at the same time, I do understand there are quite a few players out there that are either intimidated by the timer of the Mythic Plus system or just prefer untimed content in general. For these players, I think the goal of making Mythic Zeros more difficult and rewarding definitely fell a bit flat, where at least from my perspective, they only seemed marginally harder than Mythic Zeros back in Dragonflight. And again, there's another idea I'm going to be stealing from Banchers here, where he suggests a potential hard mode version of every Mythic Zero dungeon, which could be turned on at the start of Mythic Zero, and it would be tuned to the difficulty of like a current plus 10, maybe considering fortified and tyrannical, but it doesn't have the added timer and it doesn't have the added affixes. Details would need to be ironed out, and of course tuning, you can adjust that of course, but you could do things like making this either a daily lockout for that Mythic Zero dungeon, or even make the hard mode specifically a weekly lockout depending on how you want to reward it. You could also implement that death system that we just talked about, that they are putting out in surveys as well, into the hard mode versions of these Mythic Zero dungeons. Rewards, I think Banter suggested that it drop hero track gear, like 1 out of 6 hero gear, and then it rewards 6 out of 6 hero gear in the vault. But again, that's something that could be fine-tuned. This is just kind of the bare bones of a system that I think could coexist with Mythic Plus and have pretty decent rewards available to players who don't want to do the Mythic Plus timer affix shenanigans. Switching gears from Mythic Plus stuff, as a tank main, I'd be remiss if I didn't take some time here to talk about the state of tanks this season and the nerfs that happened during beta and how everything kind of played out, which kind of as expected has resulted in tank players being pretty sparse. I do want to actually directly respond to some of the statements that they made in their big tank blue post before the expansion launched and discuss what actually happened this season versus what their goal was. So to start, one of their stated goals was wanting to reinforce the importance of the healer role and work towards gameplay where tanks and healers collaborate. This one kind of also pairs with another stated goal of making tank damage intake steady and not too fast. And I think in terms of both goals, they've definitely missed the mark. Looking at pretty much all tank deaths that happen in keys, almost none of them are from the tank steadily taking damage over time and eventually dying. Instead, you have a combination of excessively hard-hitting magic tank busters in combination with very, very dangerous regular melee swings that kill tanks in the span of 2 seconds or less. When I've seen deaths from 100 to 0 in 0.1 seconds, for example, as well. Definitely not steady, and also definitely not enough time for a healer to react and actually help the tank out. This kind of gameplay was explicitly addressed in their post as well, where they said that having to constantly maintain defensives and being in danger of getting killed out of nowhere if they drop is unsatisfying, which I 100% agree with. However, that is the current world that we're living in Mythic Plus, so I think they need to take a pretty hard look at how dungeon content is actually designed and align those goals with their goals for tank design for it to actually be successful. Now, what does that even mean? Well, let's take a look at the recent tank buster tuning as an example. First off, way too slow. It got put in halfway through December, season started in September. You just need to be faster on the trigger here, straight up. Like, these changes aren't going to bring anyone back, but if they were implemented way earlier in the season, they maybe would have stopped some players from leaving or re-rolling off of the tank role. Looking at the actual content of the nerfs, One of them really sticks out to me, and those are the nerfs to Shadowclaw, one of the largest tank busters this season from the despoiler mobs in Stone Vault. Previously, this was a 1 second cast, meaning you basically needed to have some external add-on or weak aura tracking the cooldown of this ability so that you could preemptively defensive it, because you just don't have enough time to react to the cast once it's already started. And again, since it's such a large hit, this would one-shot tanks with nothing active. The nerf they ended up doing to it, on top of increasing its cooldown, was increasing this cast time to 2.5 seconds. And personally, I think 2.5 seconds should be the baseline for Tank Buster cast time. It gives you enough time to actually react without external tools. Plus, it's enough time that if you spent a global just before the cast actually started, you'd be able to use another global before that cast finishes. Obviously, making every Tank Buster the same, it's going to get a bit monotonous. That's not what I'm asking for here. Maybe you can make some trade-offs from this base time. So, hey, we're going to make this cast on a bit faster. That means we're going to peel off some of the upfront damage. Maybe we're going to turn some of the damage into a dot. Maybe a large portion of the damage is going to be in the form of a dot, so the initial cast time doesn't matter as much. Those kinds of things to adjust it. But basically, anything that is hitting extremely hard in one hit needs to have a cast time that you can reasonably react to. I think an ability like Subjugate from the first boss in City of Threads is a great example of something that should probably be at least a half second longer in terms of cast time, whereas something like Obsidian Beam from the first boss in the Dawnbreaker has a totally reasonable cast time that gives you plenty of time to react and prepare for the big hit it does. Now, the second part of this nerf, as I mentioned earlier, was an increase to the ability's cooldown, which I think is also very important because this season we're seeing a ton of these very large, dangerous magic tank busters, such that we're having pulls back to back to back to back here where they're happening every 10 to 20 seconds. And sometimes these pulls, they force multiple of these mobs into a single pull. And a lot of tank specs just kind of struggle to mitigate that much magic damage at that rate. It's probably part of why Prot Paladins feel so much better than a lot of other tanks this season in terms of actively surviving packs, because the combination of Consecrate plus getting to 100% spell block with Word of Glory is enough to mitigate these hits in most situations on its own, and that they can do basically on demand. And I'm not saying here that tanks shouldn't be punished for not mitigating something. Managing your defensives is part of the role, and it's something I personally enjoy a lot, but the tools that different tank specs have are not equal, especially when it comes to surviving magical one-shots with minimal reaction time every 10 to 20 seconds. At some point, they're just going to run out of buttons. And so this is the area I really want Blizzard to take a look at going into Season 2 in terms of the dungeon pool. Give tank busters a longer base cast time, make sure the frequency in pulls is not overwhelming, and scale the damage up and down according to these other vectors to mix things up, right? Are we going to put 2 of these mobs in a pack? Are we going to make this one a little bit quicker? Adjust the damage accordingly. Moving back to the tank nerfs briefly here, I do think there were some spots that got a bit over nerfed to the point where they have like 0% or close to 0% pick rate if they're a talent. And the big one is attack power scaling self-healing. Word of Glory was the notorious one at the start of the season, which has now seen several buffs putting it in a better spot, but there are a lot of other similar abilities that have seen no buffs that remain basically unpicked. Things like Ursock's Fury and After the Wildfire for Guardian Druid, I'm sure more for other tank specs, which just heal for so little relative to player health pools, and it's only going to get worse as the expansion goes on, thanks to the increased stamina scaling this expansion. So abilities like that definitely need to see some love. On top of that, with the news that AUG is no longer going to be buffing healers or tanks next season, I think it's not a bad idea to implement some buffs here across the board to tank specs, just make them feel a little bit better on their own, because there's no coincidence that tank players love playing with AUGs because they got a pretty significant offensive and defensive benefit from them. Some buffs would also potentially help address the aggro issues that we've seen this season, which have been a bit crazy, where the highest damage tank in Prot Paladin was still routinely having threat issues, sometimes even while having a misdirect in the group. I know there was recently a 22% buff to tank threat in a hotfix on the live servers, but that is a bit of a band-aid, especially when you consider that DPS specs are going to scale better in terms of damage output with gear than tanks as the expansion goes on. So it just kind of kicks that issue down the line a little bit, and it could even be a problem again as soon as next season. Personally, I think threat has a place, but it's problematic when I'm playing my rotation correctly, optimally. I'm doing good damage for my spec, but I'm still losing threat to a DPS player. I think the thing that sticks in my head is a clip from Yoda where, he uses bubble taunt on a pack, he bops the enhancement shaman, and still after all that, he ends up losing aggro. So yeah, something for sure needs to change on threat, and maybe that's as simple as, again, a damage buff combined with a durability buff for the Og stuff across the board, two tanks to give them a bit more power overall. In general, I think that Blizzard does need to do a bit better in terms of incentivizing more players to actually play roles like tank, like healer, despite the additional responsibility these roles have. And being able to pump damage certainly is a part of that. I think also reducing the punishment for mistakes a bit would also help, which I talked about earlier with that Challenger's Peril 15-second death timers and how that adds a lot more stress onto the tank role specifically, as well as just making things feel a bit more fair. It doesn't feel fair to get one shot by a 1-second cast time ability that had its cast time delayed by spell queuing, which resulted in you being stuck mid-global and unable to react to it, right? It doesn't feel fair having to mitigate these one shots every like 10, 15 seconds in back-to-back-to-back packs that all last a minute or more, and you just run out of defensive abilities because you're not a prop paladin that can spam 100% spell block. At the end of the day, all these things push players away from the role, which is probably why there seems to be such a shortage of tanks so far this season. All right, tank rant officially over for now. I reserve my right to do another one later on. Let's move on to my final topic, rating, which is actually something that I only had some minor issues with, and a lot of those seem to be getting addressed with the new raid Renown track that is being implemented in 11.1. For those that don't know, this is going to be 20 ranks and has everything you'd want and more stuff that I didn't even think I wanted until I saw it attached to it, including things like scaling warband damage and healing buff that we had this season, the raid skip, they've got the raid teleport in here, and even the return of dinars to allow you to purchase any item you want that you can then upgrade to the max myth track eye level. My only concern here is the rate at which you gain renown, because if it's something like 1 renown per week, I can see it being way too slow for both the raid buff and the dinars, where the former gives 3% damage and healing every 3 weeks starting at week 4, and the latter gives you a dinar on week 17 and 19. Again, the rate here could be different, so if it's faster than 1 renown per week, this is kind of irrelevant, but for me at least, I think the 3% damage and healing increase should probably be every 2 weeks or so starting at week 4, so it'd be a little bit faster or a little bit more power than the current raid buff. I think this one was a little bit slow. And for the dinar, I think the first dinar should be available no later than week 10, and maybe you could argue it could be even earlier, like week 8 or even week 6, just because most players do not play patches for much longer than 2.5 months. If players look at this track and they're like, I have to play for 17 weeks before I can get my dinar, a lot of people are just going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to play for that long. That is way too long to get a dinar. I'm just going to stop playing at some point earlier than that, right? If this is instead at a much more reasonable initial goal, like week 8, for example, I think that's going to encourage more people to get that dinar and maybe then play with that item that they got with the dinar. You can leave that second dinar to be later in the track to help those players that are more committed, have played more, and are maybe having just some bad luck. Leave that one, at week 16, 17, 18, wherever you want it. But I think that first one should be much, much earlier. From there, we can speak a little bit about boss tuning. I think Blizzard has been pretty vocal in acknowledging the jump between Renown and Brood Twister was a bit too high. Plus, Sikrin and Renown themselves were probably a bit too easy. Not going to talk anymore on that specifically. When it comes to nerfs, I think they generally did a very good job at putting them out this season compared to a Myrdrasil, which is probably a bit too slow. The one exception here, I think, is Silken Court, where the second set of nerfs probably should have been a couple weeks earlier, but overall, much improved here. They also did a pretty solid job at reducing weak aura bosses, with one existing in this raid in Brood Twister, and apparently, according to some interviews, they have some new stuff planned to reduce add-on capabilities. So we'll have to see what happens here in the next raid with that, as well as some of their other adjustments that they announced recently, including a new swirly indicator that is hopefully more clear and easy to see, as well as more use of the environment in raid fights, which I don't know what that means, but again, hopefully it's better than something like Xal'atath. Not have a great time on that boss. But there we have it, guys. This video is definitely way longer than I wanted to be, but that is season 1 in review. Let me know what you guys think of my suggestions. Let me know if I missed anything. Leave those comments down below. Would love to hear from you guys. Love having conversations with you about it. Again, I'll be putting out my usual tank, dungeon, and raid guide content in season 2, so make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Otherwise, shout out to all my amazing Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.